Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal when Marco Rios was first drawn into the treacherous scheme masterminded by his father, Gen Sidwell. He had no idea that the path he chose would ultimately lead him to a precipice so perilous it threatened to destroy everything he valued as freedom, his love, his conscience, and his very identity. At the outset, Marco saw his unwavering loyalty to Sidwell not as submission, but as a necessary panacea means of reconciling the long-standing fracture in their family. A fracture carved deeply by the absence of his late mother and the silent blame he carried for her abandonment. Sidwell, a man cloaked in the power of wealth, political influence, and cold calculation, had always towered over Marco not only as a father but as a commanding force of nature. And Marco, longing for purpose and a place within a legacy greater than himself, allowed that force to consume his sense of judgment. He told himself that by supporting Sidwell's grand design, he was helping his family reclaim influence, fortify their name, and right old wrongs. But what he failed to see was that he was not a partner in the plane he was upon. As Marco began participating in the early stages of the plot, he witnessed Sidwell manipulate the levers of law and power with unsettling ease. Sidwell didn't just bend the rules, broke them, rewrote them, and then used those same rewritten rules to suffocate the innocent. It wasn't long before Marco found himself entangled in a narrative soaked with lies, coercion, and the threat of violence. The pivotal maneuver in Sidwell's twisted strategy was a scheme to destroy Sonny Corinthos by framing him for the murder of Judge Eva Heron. Sidwell, through layers of bribery and calculated deception, had coerced the judge into ruling in favor of Michael Corinthos in the custody battle over Wiley and Amelia. To bolster his fabricated storyline, Sidwell falsely claimed that Sonny had bribed the judge to crush Willow's parental rights. But that was only the beginning. When Eva Heron was found dead, the calculated chaos escalated into something far darker than Marco could have anticipated. Sidwell, ever the puppeteer, saw her death not as a crisis but as a golden opportunity to seal Sonny's fate once and for all. By falsifying evidence and weaponizing public suspicion, he painted Sonny as the ruthless mobster who silenced a judge to hide his own corruption. Every thread of Sidwell's operation had been sown with deception and reinforced by lies. But Marco, who had been following instructions and carrying out errands without question, was beginning to see the truth beneath the surface. The death of Heron wasn't a tragic consequence, it was a premeditated move in a game Marco no longer wanted to play. And as the bodies began to pile up and the lies grew too dense to keep straight, Marco's internal world began to fracture. For Marco, the realization that his father wasn't just bending morality but obliterating it completely was nothing short of devastating. He had believed in the illusion of strategy and legacy. He had believed that Sidwell, despite his flaws, was working for a cause that could somehow justify the shadows it cast. But what he saw now was a man driven not by redemption or righteousness, but by domination. Sidwell wasn't protecting his family, he was weaponizing it. And Marco, once so desperate to earn his father's respect, now understood that he had been molded into a disposable instrument of destruction. The manipulation ran so deep that Marco found himself questioning whether anything in his life had been genuine, or whether even his memories had been rewritten by the needs of Sidwell's ambitions. As the weight of Sidwell's crimes began to press down on him, Marco's guilt evolved into a suffocating force. He could no longer dismiss the blood on his hands as theoretical or justified. He could no longer compartmentalize his complicity as simply following orders. He had stood by while an innocent man was framed, while a woman was murdered to serve a narrative, and while his father systematically dismantled the lives of everyone who stood in the way. Marco's emotional and psychological descent was swift, but not immediate. It began with unease, then escalated into paranoia, and ultimately became a full-fledged moral reckoning. Every time he looked into the eyes of Lucas Jones, the man who offered him love, hope, and a glimpse of a different life, saw what he stood to lose. Not just Lucas, but the version of himself he could have been. Yet the turning point came not from guilt, but from fear of what Sidwell might do next, and fear of how far Marco would have to go to protect a man who had no limits. Sidwell's worldview was built on the assumption that people are either tools or threats, and when tools begin to question their purpose, they become threats. Marco knew that if he stepped out of line, he wouldn't be spared for being family. His father had proven that blood meant nothing when power was at stake. The day Marco realized that Sidwell might kill him just as easily as he'd killed Heron was the day something inside him broke. Compliance turned into quiet rebellion. He began documenting everything: emails, phone calls, offshore accounts, payments to Eva Heron before and after the custody ruling, fake depositions, and the mechanisms used to plant fabricated evidence on Sonny. He dug deeper than he ever had before, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. But this quiet resistance came with risks. Sidwell was growing suspicious, and the more nervous he became, the more volatile his behavior turned. Meanwhile, Sonny's allies began circling. Jason Morgan and Anna Devane were both following the scent of something foul. And it was only a matter of time before Marco found himself pinned between two forces that could destroy him, one in the name of justice, and one in the name of survival. Marco understood that the day of reckoning was coming. He could either go down with his father's crumbling empire or become the catalyst that exposed it. But the choice was not simple. Turning on Sidwell could mean death, literal and metaphorical. His father could retaliate in ways no courtroom could prevent. At the same time, remaining silent meant living a life of perpetual fear, alienation from Lucas, and the complete erosion of whatever integrity he had left. The thought of becoming Sidwell's scapegoat, of going to prison so that his father could walk away and scat, had haunted him. He had seen the ease with which Sidwell manufactured guilt. If it came down to choosing between them, Marco knew Sidwell would let him burn. Haunted by the growing awareness of what he had become and terrified by what he might lose, Marco stood at the edge of an irreversible decision. To turn against his father would be to admit he had been wrong from the very beginning, not just in action, but in character. But it was also the only way forward. In one final act of courage, Marco handed over the evidence to Jason and then vanished, leaving behind a cryptic message for Lucas, a silent apology, and a promise that if he survived what came next, he would find his way back. Not as the man Sidwell had raised him to be, but as the man he was finally choosing to become. And so, the saga continues, so not just of crime and punishment, but of the excruciating path toward redemption. Marco's journey is far from over, but the illusion has been shattered. The man once used as a pawn in a deadly game is now willing to burn the board, no matter the cost. Marco had once believed that his position within his father's orbit afforded him a level of control, a buffer zone of calculated distance that would shield him from the consequences of Sidwell's darker dealings. He told himself that he was a facilitator, not a conspirator, that his involvement was strategic, limited, and essential to ensuring a broader goal. But in the depths of that delusion lay his greatest error. In a reckless gambit driven by ego, fear, and the desire to prove his value to Sidwell, Marco took it upon himself to directly challenge Sonny Corinthos. Believing he could outmaneuver one of the most dangerous and instinctively cunning men in Port Charles. His attempt to destabilize Sonny's influence wasn't just naive, it was catastrophic. In a moment of misguided confidence, Marco released partial fabricated evidence that painted Sonny as the mastermind behind Judge Eva Heron's death. His hope was that the move would force Sonny onto the defensive, disrupt his alliances, and allow Sidwell to seize control over both the deception empire and the narrative surrounding the custody battle. But Marco gravely misjudged who Sonny truly was. What Marco failed to account for was that Sonny Corinthos was not just a powerful man with a loyal network, was a survivor of countless betrayals, a tactician forged in the crucible of mob politics, and a man who never moved without calculating the full scope of consequence. Rather than buckle under pressure, Sonny responded with swift, ruthless precision, not only discrediting the false evidence but dismantling the entire infrastructure that Sidwell had constructed in secret. Sonny's retaliation was methodical and devastating. Within days, key elements of Sidwell's conspiracy began to unravel. Independent investigators, spurred by pressure from Sonny's legal team, began re-examining the custody case and found irregularities in court filings and financial records linked to Heron. Subpoenas were issued, whistleblowers emerged, and leaked documents began circulating, revealing layers of forgery and coercion. The fabricated documents Marco had helped introduce were traced back to burner accounts and metadata that pointed directly to Sidwell's operations. The illusion of invulnerability Sidwell had long projected shattered almost overnight. What had once been a fortress of lies collapsed under the weight of truth, and the empire Sidwell had so carefully fortified was now a smoldering ruin under federal scrutiny. As Sidwell's world caved in, he did what many powerful men do when cornered, looked for someone to blame. And Marco, once his favored son and silent enforcer, became the most convenient scapegoat. Sidwell spun a new narrative, one in which Marco had acted independently, exceeded his mandate, and jeopardized everything through a series of impulsive and unauthorized actions. In front of federal investigators and media operatives, Sidwell disavowed Marco's involvement, portraying himself as a misled parent devastated by his son's rogue behavior. The betrayal was surgical, absolute, and cold. Marco had not only lost the man he once called father, but now stood alone, vilified and vulnerable, caught between two worlds that no longer offered him safety. Worse still was the damage done to the one person Marco had truly allowed himself to love, Lucas Jones. Their relationship, fragile but genuine, had always rested on the hope that Marco was trying to carve out a better version of himself. Lucas, ever compassionate, had looked past Marco's association with Sidwell, believing that deep down, Marco's heart yearned for redemption. But when Lucas learned of Marco's role in the dissemination of fabricated evidence and his indirect involvement in the events leading to Hevan's death, the illusion was broken. Hevan had once been Lucas's mentor, a figure of legal integrity who'd guided him through difficult professional choices. The revelation that Marco had been complicit in her downfall was not just disappointing, it was unforgivable. The emotional fallout was immediate. Lucas distanced himself, retreating behind a wall of professional coldness and personal grief. The warmth that had once existed between them turned to silence, and Marco was left adrift, exiled not only from his father's circle but from the one man who had seen something worth saving in him. The weight of that disappointment crushed Marco more than any legal threat ever could. For the first time, he understood the true cost of his actions, not in headlines, subpoenas, or public disgrace, but in the quiet absence of someone who once believed in him. Caught in a spiraling vortex of legal peril, public condemnation, and personal isolation, Marco was faced with a choice that had long been inevitable: to continue shielding the man who had manipulated, used, and discarded him, or to turn against Sidwell in a final, desperate act of self-preservation and moral clarity. But the path forward was perilous. Choosing to expose Sidwell meant not only crossing the man who had trained him to be complicit, but also accepting the role he played in the destruction of others. It meant confessing, cooperating, and possibly facing prison time, not as a pawn, but as a participant. Yet for Marco, there was no longer a viable alternative. The walls were closing in, and Sidwell had shown that loyalty meant nothing when his empire was at stake. The decision to betray Sidwell was not made out of vengeance, but necessity, a last stand for what remained of his dignity. But even as he compiled evidence, prepared statements, and reached out to Jason Morgan with guarded overtures of cooperation, he knew that survival was not guaranteed. Sidwell's reach extended beyond legal realms. There were enforcers, operatives, and shadows that would not take kindly to betrayal. If Sidwell could orchestrate the death of a judge, silencing his own son would be well within his capacity. Still, Marco moved forward, motivated not only by fear, but by a stubborn flicker of self-respect. He had once believed himself capable of navigating his father's world without becoming its victim. That illusion had cost him nearly everything. But perhaps, if he acted truthfully, courageously, could salvage the one thing he had never truly possessed: autonomy. His cooperation could bring down the remaining pieces of Sidwell's corrupted machinery, exonerate Sonny, and perhaps even give Lucas the closure he deserved. Whether redemption would follow was uncertain. But Marco no longer sought redemption in the eyes of others. He sought it in the mirror. For once, he needed to be able to look at himself without flinching. And if that meant becoming the very instrument of his father's fall, then so be it. He was done being the pawn. It was time to become the reckoning. As Marco Rios embarked on what would become the most dangerous and morally defining journey of his life, he knew that each step toward truth was a step away from everything familiar, even his own sense of identity. The decision to turn against Jen Sidwell was not made in a single moment, but rather crystallized through the cumulative weight of betrayal, blood, and the shattering of illusions that had long governed his loyalties. Determined to expose the sprawling, insidious network of judicial corruption and criminal manipulation Sidwell had built over years, Marco began to collect and organize evidence with a new, grim clarity. He was no longer his father's pawn, was his greatest liability. Working in near total secrecy, Marco retrieved digital records from encrypted servers, siphoned off files from burner accounts, traced the flow of illegal financial transfers, and copied forged documents that had been used to implicate Sonny Corinthos. Every fragment he uncovered told a darker story than the last, a tale of rigged custody battles, falsified death certificates, witness intimidation, political blackmail, and carefully orchestrated murders, all woven into a sophisticated web of lies, stitched together by Sidwell's insatiable hunger for dominance. Marco painstakingly compiled this evidence into secure backups and distributed copies to multiple off-site servers, ensuring that even if he were found or silenced, the truth would not die with him. But what began as a mission of justice quickly turned into a cat-and-mouse game that tested every ounce of his resilience. Marco knew Sidwell well enough to anticipate the moment his father would sense the shift. Sidwell was a predator whose instincts for betrayal were sharper than any blade. And once the walls of his empire began to tremble, he didn't hesitate to unleash his reach against his own blood. Marco's movements were soon shadowed by anonymous threats and traceable calls in the dead of night, surveillance he couldn't shake, and break-ins that left his belongings untouched but meticulously rearranged, a chilling warning that he was being watched, and that time was running out. As the pressure mounted, Marco shared a portion of the evidence with the Port Charles Police Department carefully, through an intermediary, without revealing his identity. He understood the risk of exposure. The PD had its own vulnerabilities, and Sidwell's influence could very well reach into its ranks. But he needed the truth to begin threading its way into official channels. More urgently, he encrypted and forwarded a curated packet of the most damning evidence to Jason Morgan Simeone with both the force and discretion to act. Jason had long stood on the fringe of both law and order, and Marco knew that if anyone understood the lethal stakes of this game, it would be him. It was a desperate act of faith, but one Marco made with the grim understanding that a line had been crossed, and there was no turning back. Yet the deeper Marco pushed into his mission, the more he discovered that doing the right thing was not a clean act of heroism. It was messy, isolating, and brutal. His every move strained the few remaining connections he had left in Port Charles. Friends distanced themselves, confused by his cryptic behavior. Lucas, whose heart Marco had already fractured, now saw only more reason to walk away. Former allies became suspicious. Every door Marco knocked on for help seemed to close more quickly than the last. He was branded a traitor by some, a liar by others, and a ghost by those too frightened to acknowledge what he had become. Sidwell, meanwhile, did not sit idle. With each passing day, Marco felt the full weight of his father's wrath. No longer a disappointed patriarch, Sidwell had morphed into a predator in defense of his empire. His legal team began crafting a new narrative that Marco was mentally unstable, acting out of delusion, and seeking revenge for past grievances. Rumors were seeded into the press. Anonymous statements surfaced, portraying Marco as erratic, emotionally volatile, and dangerous. At the same time, Sidwell's private enforcers tightened their circle around Marco, eroding his sense of safety with every passing hour. The streets he once walked with confidence now felt like a labyrinth of invisible crosshairs. It became painfully clear that Sidwell was willing to go to any lengths to preserve his empire, even if it meant eliminating his own son. Marco could feel it in the silence on the other end of the phone when he tried to reach out to his father one last time. There was no more room for emotion. Sidwell had replaced it with survival instinct, and in his world, threats were extinguished, not negotiated with. For Marco, that realization felt like the final nail in the coffin of their already shattered relationship. He had not just lost his father, had become his father's target. And still, Marco pressed on. Every moment of his day became a carefully calculated risk. He changed phones daily, slept in different locations, encrypted his digital footprints, and carried with him a kill switch, an automatic release of all remaining evidence should something happen to him. But even these precautions felt increasingly futile. He wasn't just fighting a legal battle. He was navigating a moral battlefield littered with ghosts of the innocent, fragments of trust, and the ever-present specter of death. There were nights when he questioned whether his crusade would amount to anything, whether justice would ever rise from the swamp of deceit Sidwell had cultivated. But then he'd remember the names: Eva Heron, the parents who lost custody, the families destroyed by a single man's ambition. And he would continue, bruised but unrelenting. Marco had once craved purpose, validation, and legacy under the towering shadow of his father. But now, he forged something else entirely stance. And though the cost grew heavier with each breath he took, so too did the resolve within him. He might have started as a pawn in Sidwell's empire, but in defying him, Marco had become something far more dangerous, a witness with nothing left to lose, and the keys to burn an empire down. Marco's crisis of conscience had evolved far beyond a simple moral dilemma between right and wrong. It had transformed into a brutal reckoning of survival between truth and illusion. He stood on a precipice where each path forward bore its own perilous consequence. Silence meant survival, at least temporarily. It meant allowing Sidwell to continue his reign of deception and bloodshed, enabling a father who would stop at nothing to maintain control, even if it meant sacrificing more innocent lives to preserve his empire. But silence also meant complicity, becoming the very shadow he sought to escape. On the other hand, speaking out, continuing the path of whistleblowing, meant facing almost certain destruction. If he continued to provide evidence, to align himself with the likes of Sonny Corinthos and Jason Morgan, and to inch closer toward justice, he would expose himself not only to Sidwell's lethal retaliation but also to legal jeopardy. He could be tried and imprisoned as a co-conspirator. He could lose the last shreds of his reputation. And worse still, he could lose his life. The psychological pressure became suffocating. Marco found himself locked in a state of perpetual anxiety, unable to sleep, unable to trust, and able to stop reliving every choice he'd made that had brought him to this threshold. The fear of retribution was omnipresent, but even more tormenting was the crushing weight of his own guilt. The faces of those hurt by Sidwell's corruption, families torn apart, careers ruined, a judge murdered, haunted him. His complicity had made them victims. His delay in acting had given Sidwell more time to destroy. And now, he had no illusions left. The truth was clear: if he stayed silent, he was no better than the men he sought to escape. His silence would not make him safe. It would make him a monster. In that clarity, Marco made his choice. He chose to fight not just against Sidwell, but against the legacy of control, fear, and manipulation that had defined his life. He chose to stand with Sonny, Lucas, and the law. He chose to testify, to bring forth every last piece of evidence, to name names, to document timelines, to place himself on the record. He chose to break the cycle. He chose to burn the bridge behind him so that no one, including himself, could ever walk back across it. And in that moment of terrifying honesty, Marco ceased to be Sidwell's pawn. He became something far more dangerous, a witness with first-hand knowledge and a conscience finally awakened. The repercussions were swift and seismic. The collapse of Gen Sidwell did not merely shake the foundations of political influence and judicial manipulation in Port Charles, it sent tremors through the very architecture of unchecked power. With Marco's testimony, the network Sidwell had built crumbled like glass under the weight of exposed truth. Secret bank accounts, falsified court orders, coerced judges, forged legal briefs, each carefully concealed piece was brought into daylight. Prosecutors moved quickly. Arrests were made. Alliances broke. Names that had once held sway in City Hall and the courts now faced indictments and subpoenas. Sidwell himself, once untouchable, was left with nowhere to hide. His name, once a symbol of prestige and control, became synonymous with treachery and ruin. But even as the world watched the fall of a kingpin, Marco's internal war raged on. The path he had chosen was righteous, but righteousness did not bring him peace. He had done what was necessary, but necessity did not erase the past. He still bore the scars of his own misdeeds. He still carried the knowledge that lives had been shattered while he stood in silence. He still lived with the hollow ache left behind by Lucas, whose absence cut deeper than any enemy ever could. Marco had hoped, perhaps naively, that exposing the truth might win back trust, might rebuild something between them, might show Lucas the man he had become rather than the man he had been. But healing was not a guarantee. Redemption, even when earned, did not always restore what was lost. And there was still the ever-looming threat of Sidwell's retribution. Though imprisoned and disgraced, Sidwell was a man whose reach had not fully withered. There were whispers of loyalists, of revenge, of silent hands waiting for the moment Marco let his guard down. Even in victory, Marco could not relax. He had survived the empire, but now he had to survive its aftershocks. Still, amid the ashes of his former life, something quietly began to take root. Marco no longer walked in fear of his father's name. He no longer lived under delusion that power was protection. He had become a symbol imperfect, battle-worn, but undeniable proof that even those raised in darkness could choose the light. His life would never be simple, never be free of the past, but it was his now no longer controlled, no longer dictated, no longer defined by the sins of another man. Whether Lucas would ever return, whether the world would ever fully forgive, whether Marco would find peace, those questions remained unanswered. But one truth endured: Marco Rios had stood against a legacy of evil, and by doing so, ensured it would end with him. He had broken the chain. Sometimes, it only takes one person to stand up, and an entire empire of cruelty will come crashing down. Marco had been that person, and in doing so, he proved that even the most entangled lives can be reclaimed if only we are brave enough to sever the strings that bind us.